Hi guys, welcome to Stretch Projects. Today we're going to be creating the game 4 in a row using HTML5's Canvas and JavaScript. So in terms of how we go about playing the game, each player is going to see an input request. They're going to select where they want to place their disk, and eventually they will see a win-lose status. If we consider what we're going to actually need to do within the program, you can see that we're going to display a page, we're going to ask for an input. For every input, we're going to check whether the player has matched 4 disks together. If they have, we'll show a winning dialog box. If not, we'll ask for more inputs. So I've just gone ahead and created the basic HTML template for our page. I've also just created a blank JavaScript file. Now I'm actually going to make this as a jQuery plugin. And so the first thing we're going to do is to set up our handler for jQuery. I don't want to be able to load multiple instances of this, and so I'm first off going to check that our plugin, which we're going to call 4 in a row, isn't already loaded. And assuming that our plugin isn't already loaded, we're going to load it into the browser's memory. And again, we're going to use strict mode so that we can be slightly more future-proof in our project. Now, if you've watched my anatomy of a jQuery plugin video, you'll recognize a lot of what we've done here. So basically, we've checked if the plugin is already loaded and made sure that we can't load it multiple times. We've then created a very basic plugin handler, which we can only pass options into. And then we've created strict mode inside of that function. Because if we was to use strict mode outside of the function, that would apply to every jQuery plugin that we're going to use on our website. And that might not be the case. Other developers might not have developed to strict mode. And so we could potentially break other people's plugins. So the next thing we're going to need to do is actually handle these options. So the first thing we should do is to actually set some defaults for the options that we're going to pass across. And this is really simple. So we just create a variable called settings. We're going to, because options is an object, we're just going to extend it like that. And we obviously want to set some defaults, which we do in here. And so this is things like the canvas name. So we're actually going to set more than just the name, or sorry, the ID of the canvas though. We're also going to set the background color, because we're going to use the canvas itself as our board, the blue color. So I'm just going to create another object inside of this. So the ID is going to be 4 in a row. And the background is going to be, I'm going to set this to royal blue, but you can obviously pick whichever colours you prefer. So next up, we're going to have some disks, and we're going to want to set some sizes based on what we actually prefer. So we're going to set a disk, and we're going to create another object here. So we're going to set a diameter, and we're going to set this as default. Now later on we'll be actually determining what default means, but we're going to do this so that we can allow the users to actually override our preferences kind of thing. We're also going to set some padding. I'm going to set that to 8 pixels. But in fact, we can just do that as a number. Next up, we're going to set some options for text. So this is the text that we see at the end of a game when someone's won. And again, there's going to be multiple options here. So we're going to set the size, and I'm just going to set that to 80. I'm going to set the font, and set that to Arial. We're also going to set padding on this as well. Set that to 8 again. Finally, we're just going to set some targets. Now, this is not strictly necessary, but it allows us to make the code a bit more extendable. So we're going to look for 4 of the same coloured discs in a row. If we decided to change the game later on, we would just do that through changing this option here. And next off, we're just going to set the page background. I'm going to set that to white. As I say, we're going to actually use the canvas as our blue background, and so to make it look transparent, we're going to set the backgrounds for the circles that we're going to draw on to the same colour as the page. So if you think about the core of the game, we basically have a table with various cells, 7 by 6, and as the game progresses, these cells are assigned to one of the teams. And so the next thing that we should do is to create a 2-dimensional array so that we can actually save all of this data as we're progressing. So I'm just going to do that here. Now I'm actually going to pre-populate all of the cells so that when we're cycling through and looking for the actual win condition, it's going to be more predictable. And so to do that, we're just going to create some empty arrays. Now as you can see, that's 7 cells wide. That's because that's how our board is going to be. And it's also going to be 6 cells tall. So we've basically created our board here in the format of an array. So our board's basically going to start at 0, 0 on the bottom left, which will be this cell here, ending at 5, 6, which will be this cell here. The array is essentially upside down, so this will be the bottom line, while this will be the top line. So the next thing we're going to do is to start to implement some of the code. So I talked earlier about how we're going to create a background using this ID and this background property. So we do that by creating a canvas element. And we actually need to declare a canvas just as an empty variable at the moment, because we're obviously going to populate that as we progress. And again, because we've set this setting up here, all we need to do now, we also need to create a context, because that's how we actually manipulate our canvases. We do that just to create another empty variable up here. And because this game's 2D, we're just going to get the 2D context of the element. And now that we've actually accessed our canvas, we can set our background. And to do that, we just do canvas.setBackground. Sorry, .style.background. And because we're using these properties from our options, from our settings, we're able to change these later on if we need to, just by changing the options as we initialize the plugin. Now the next thing that we did when we were creating our settings was this diameter. We set it to default. Now we actually need to determine what default means. So to do that, we just need to check whether, first off, the plugin is being loaded with the default settings. We just want to basically divide the width by 7 and account for the padding. So we divide the canvas width by 7. And then we also account for the padding. And we've got padding on either side of each disk, which is why we multiply it by 2. Now, a lot of this has been quite hypothetical so far. We've not actually done anything to our canvas. We've just set some properties up for it. And so I think the next thing we should do is to start drawing all of the circles that we're going to need. So to do that, we're going to create a new function called drawCircle. And just for the sake of it, we're going to call it straight away. Now to actually draw the circles, we just have to manipulate the context. And we do that by first off beginning paths. And we're going to draw an arc which goes all the way around. So when we're drawing an arc, we're going to actually need a couple of properties. So we're going to need an X and a Y position based on the center of the arc that we're going to draw. And so that we can actually draw many circles, we're going to want to pass that through the function. So these are the center X and the center Y. So when we're drawing our circles, we'll just pick out each of the X and Y positions and draw from there. Next up, we're going to need a diameter, and we've obviously got that in our settings. So we actually need the radius, and so it's just a matter of dividing the diameter by 2. Next up, we just need to set some more defaults. Now we obviously want it to be a full circle, hence the matter pi. And you can customize this a lot more as well if you desire. So because of the way the canvas works, at this point we've only selected the area that we're going to use. Next we need to actually draw something into there. So we're also going to want to add some shadow into the mix to make things look a little bit better. So I'll just go ahead and code some of this. Now of course you could go through and add all of these individual properties to your options so that you can customize them more as you're going along. But for the sake of this video, I'm not going to do that, just to speed things up a little. So now that we've set all of these properties, we can go ahead and actually start to draw the shape. So the first thing we're going to do is actually fill the area that we've selected. Now that we've filled it, we're going to draw a line around it. So if we go ahead, I forgot to do this. We also need to attach this to the jQuery handler. It's supposed to be for in a row. So if we go ahead and actually call this function, put some default variables in there. And then we switch across to. So now we've created the ability to actually draw individual circles on our blue background. Now of course we don't want to be drawing each individual circle ourselves, we want to create a function to do that for us. Let's go ahead and do that now. For those of you who didn't see what I've just did there with NetBeans, if you press Alt, Shift and F, it automatically formats everything for you. Now we obviously don't want to be passing in specific colours here, we want to specify them in a more global context. So what I'm going to do is create another variable here called disk, which is going to be an object which we're going to use to contain all of the data specific to our disks. So we're going to have a red disk which will have some data, and we're going to have a yellow disk which will have some data. We're going to have a name, we're going to have a fill, and we're going to have a stroke. Now these are just colours that I've found look okay. You're obviously welcome to use whichever colours you prefer. Now we're going to use those settings . Now we're going to use these settings. First we need to call. We're going to pass these settings across, and so we're starting to draw our first red circles. Now we obviously want to draw yellow and red circles, so To do that, we're just going to have a simple switch statement. We're just going to use the background for the page here. And it's going to be the same for the fill and the stroke. Which means that when we type in red, we should be able to display a red set. We should be able to display a red disk. Or if we type in yellow, it's a yellow disk. Yep. And then if we type in nothing, it should be a white disk. So the next thing we want to do is actually spread out all of the disks depending on which column and which row they're on. And to do that, I'm just going to type out the formula and then I'll go back and explain it. So what we've done here is we've taken the width of the canvas and divided by 7 and multiplied that by column plus 1. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass in a column and row. That's there and there. So we're going to pass in the row directly from basically the array that we've got up here, the cells. And because arrays start at 0, we're just going to add 1 onto that. Next we're going to deduct the diameter, or rather the radius, because we're divided by 2, as well as the padding. And this way we're going to be able to basically find the center X position. It's very similar with the center Y. From the height we're going to deduct basically the width divided by 7. So the height's very similar. I've done that wrong. So because the height basically starts at the top left of the canvas and we're starting our arrays from the bottom, we want to basically offset the entire canvas, which is why we deduct everything from the canvas height. So we basically do something very similar. We divide the height by 7 and then we multiply it by the row again +1 because we're using it directly from the disks or the cells array. We then deduct the diameter and the padding again, which will leave us with our center Y. And so we just need to feed all of this into here rather than setting everything as 50. And so we just have CX and CY for each one. And so now we can simply pass across, for example, 2, 3. And this is on the third row. And so now we've got this functionality that we can specify which cell essentially we want to draw, but we don't want to do this for each cell either. So we'll create another function to handle that for us. What we're going to do is, as we populate, or rather as the player clicks to add their guess or their selection to each column, we're going to store the name of the player in that cell. So we'll be able to pull that back out of the actual disks array. So if we just call this now, you can see that we've got the basic gist of things, but we've obviously done something wrong. So I've gone ahead and reviewed the code, and it turns out that that 7 should actually be a 6 because the board is 6 cells high, and that actually spreads out the cells properly. Next up, there's also this, which should be a reference to the actual object that we're calling. This just makes the code a little bit more stable and less fragile. And finally, I noticed that we've got cells here twice, and we're only passing one name across, and this means that later on all we need to do is add the name of the colour to our array. So for example, if we go through here, you can see that we've added red and it shows up in the proper place. Remember that this is the bottom line and this is the top line. And the same applies to anywhere throughout. And this means that we can basically go ahead and add a function called addDisk. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to check whether the cell is already populated or not. So it's just a matter of looping through the current array and seeing whether the cell is already populated or whether it's blank or not. obviously returning true if it is, returning false if not. We're also going to need to select the column and the name of the team. So the idea is we will call this add disk function. It will check whether the cell is already populated. If it's not populated, it will add the name of the current colour to that current row. Otherwise, it will return false. And so now we can add disks ourselves manually. Basically, we need to do this before we draw the disks though. So all we can do is we basically take out the checks for the rows and we just add one to the column, and this function will add one to that column if it's possible to add it to it. Now we obviously don't want to be doing this through code each time. We want to be able to do this by clicking the picture itself. So we can add an event listener to do this for us. So to do that, all we need to do is to create a new event. Which will be activated on click. And we're going to call it an anonymous function. So if we were to add a disk here, and also redraw the disks, when we come onto our actual page, when we click, we should be able to add another disk. Now there's one problem here, which is the fact that we obviously don't click in column 1 all of the time. I can click over here, that's not column 1, and so we need to get the column dynamically. So if we try and do that, so what we're basically doing here is we're taking the bounding box of the canvas. This is basically allows us to find out where the canvas is on the page. We then take the event click X, which is basically where the click is on the entire document, and we just deduct the left of the rectangle of the canvas from the actual document position, which will give us the position relative to our canvas. We then divide that by the diameter of the disk plus the padding, and that gives us which column we're in. But to make sure that we don't overflow, we should also round down, which is what the math floor does. And if we, whoops, that should be client, and that should be bounding. But if we pass that information across, and reload, we should be able to reload this and have the disks appear in the right columns. Now there's a few things going on here. As you can see, these disks are getting more and more white, these sides are getting more and more blurry, basically because we're not resetting the canvas at the moment. We're basically drawing on top of all of the existing content every time we click. And so the next thing that we should do is reset the canvas before each actual redraw, which we can do just by creating another function. Not canvas, context. And all that's going to do, the clear rect method basically deletes anything that's within its boundaries, and so we set its boundaries to 0, 0 and then the width and height, so basically the entire canvas. So if we try again, we'll need to actually call that. So if we reset, we can see that the colours are staying the same, the shapes of the circles are staying the same, the shadows are staying the same, because we're essentially redrawing everything each click. Now the next thing you might notice is that every disk is red. We obviously need a second player, and so to do that we'll also need a toggle. So we'll just create another variable up here. That will toggle, but we also need to change this every time. So it basically just alternates between the two colours, which we should. So the next thing we're going to need to do is to actually start to think about how we check whether someone's won or not. As you can see, this is a representation of the actual board. And what we're going to do is for each cell, we're going to basically look in 4 directions. We're going to look up, right, up left, and up right. And that will basically cover every combination of possible success cases. Now when it comes to looking right, we only need to perform a check if the cell starts within the first 4 columns. So if it starts in the final 3 columns, there wouldn't be 4, which is our number. When it comes to looking up and left, we only need to perform the check if it's in the bottom right corner. So from 2, 3 to 0, 6, because again, if the cell that we were starting checking from was anywhere else, it wouldn't be possible to match up to 4 cells. And a similar position with up and right, the starting cell must be in the range 0, 0 up to 2, 3. And when it comes to looking up, we only need to look in the bottom 3 rows. So there are a couple of different ways that we could approach this. We could, for example, have completely self-contained functions, but that would be at the expense of some performance. But because we're going to be doing the same type of thing for each different actual check, I'm going to actually pull the for loops for the columns and the rows up into a single function, which will then call each individual function to perform each individual check. So first off, we're going to create a function called identify patterns. And this is just going to be 2 for loops. And then we're going to have some if statements so that we don't call the actual functions unless we actually need to. So if we're checking up, we need to check that the starting cell is going to be in the bottom few columns. So for example here we're just adding 4 in this case onto the row and making sure that it's within the range of the actual array. That will tell us whether we're beyond the actual scope of our checks. So for the next one we just need to do a similar thing. And as we start looking at the diagonal ones, we basically just need to combine the 2 in different ways. So let's have a look at the easy ones first, the up and right. So what we're going to do is from the row and the column that's passed across to us, we're going to look up for and make sure that on each occasion, that each increment, the cell above matches the target cell. Assuming it does match the target cell, it'll carry on looking for more until it gets to 4. If at any point it's different, we'll just return back to the previous function. Of course, we want to make sure that we're not looking for blank cells. So what we've basically done there is we've started at a source cell, and then we've increased by the offset, which obviously increases as the for loop increases, and checked that the cells values all match. If the cells do match, then we set the winner to be the name of the winner, basically. So we're going to need a new variable called winner. Now, to look right, we basically do the same, but we offset to the right instead of up. And so I'm just going to copy and paste this code. So as I say, we just, instead of increasing the row, we increase the column. And because checking diagonally is basically the same as checking left or right, we can copy this again. So when we're looking up and right, we basically just offset both the row and the column. And the same applies for looking diagonally left, except we offset the column negatively. So they're basically the same functions but looking in different directions. And so the next thing is to actually call this identify patterns, and to do that we just add it onto the end of the list of things that happen. I should also note that at the end of our actual function for the actual plugin itself, we need to return false. Now that should be identify patterns, not identify winner. And so we should be able to identify when someone's won, but at the same time we've not done anything to actually do anything when that happens. We've just identified that there's no event that triggers when we do identify it. And so that's what we'll focus on next. So now that we've identified a winner, we're going to want to output some text to actually congratulate them. Now this function is going to be quite similar to when we were drawing circles here. So I'm just going to go ahead and type out this function, and then I'll go over it and explain it. Again, if we were amending all of the, or rather if we were surfacing all of the static variables, if you like, in the settings, you could actually reference them here again. So what we can do now, basically this should be pretty self-explanatory. Obviously just take a fill, take a stroke, apply those colours, apply some settings to a font so that we can write text out, apply some shadow. Now this part's obviously just setting the center point for the text, which is just offset from the canvas width and also accounts for the text width. We obviously just draw the text here, and then we add another piece of text at the bottom of the screen which just says click to restart. Now we can actually take this one further and create another function here called draw fade. And what we're going to do with this function is actually just fade the background to grey, just so that there's less distraction. Now we don't actually want shadows here, so I'm just going to reset them to 0. So all I've done there is reset the shadow offsets and also basically just assigned just normal CSS here, so that we're going to get basically a black but semi-transparent screen over all of the text, or rather all of the board, which is called before we draw the text, so that when we do draw the text we're able to actually display what we want. So if we were to then go on and identify the winner, all we need to put in here is to check whether the winner is red or yellow, and if it's not either, we don't do anything. So I'll just go ahead and type this if statement out. So now let's try this out. We made a spelling mistake here. Check up left. We've got to check up rights. That's great, but we've still got to reset the actual board so that we can, when we do click, we can continue rather than just playing on. So to do this, we basically just need to create a new hard reset function. So And this is basically going to set everything back to its original state. Except for the fact that if yellow was to win a round, they should start first. So that's what this first line does. We're also going to reset winner back to 0. And then we're going to cycle through all of the cells so that we can actually reset all of their values. And we'll need to call this in here. So basically anytime that winner is already set, we're going to call hard reset, because that will be another click after displaying the winner message. That's the win condition, and now it should reset. But we need to draw the disks again. And of course that should be reds.name. Now click again. Yes. If we also just put this inside an else statement, we'll be able to actually reset without the player actually having to take a go at the same time. So if we reload this, now we will reset, and now we will be able to take another go. All of the code for this project is available on GitHub. If you have any comments or feedback, please leave it below. Thanks for watching.